Let's say the blessing for counting the Omer together. Al Sfirat HaOmer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher al Sfirat. Praise to you, Lord God, rule of the universe, who's made us holy with your commandments and command us on the counting of the Omer. That's from Leviticus. And then yesterday was the 23rd day. So you can probably guess what today's going to be, counting up. Hayom Arba'a Ve'esrim Yom Behem Shnei Shavuot Ushlosha Yamim LaOmer. Today is the 24th day, which makes 2 weeks and 3 days to the counting of the Omer.
3 days and 3 weeks and 2 days.
And so now we're going to say our La'asok B'divrei Torah blessing. Baruch atah Praise to you, Lord God, rule of the universe, who's made us holy with your commandments and command us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So I'm going to review the text that we've looked at in the past, and that will bring us up to where we are today. So we begin with a quote from Rabbi Joseph Albo: "If I knew God, I would be God." And with that caveat, we'll do the best that we can anyway. A foundational text would be the Shema from Deuteronomy. There is one God, or at least no more than one God. We also have Exodus, the 10 Commandments. I am God who brought you out of Egypt, however that happened. No other gods besides me. Sorry, that is the 10th commandment. That's the first and second commandments. Then we have two different ways of thinking about God from Adon Olam. We have the first half where God is distant and far away and in charge of everything. And then we have the second half where God is a personal God and is close. After that, we also have Avinu Malkeinu, which is from the High Holiday Liturgy. And again, we have this duality. We have Avinu Malkeinu, our parent, our sovereign, a close relationship, a distant relationship. Two different ways of thinking about God. Then we have the questions of how much does God do and how much do we do? For this, we're going to look at the Friday night blessings. So we have the candle blessing, where we say that God gave us commandments and commanded us to light the Shabbat candles. And the point of theology from here is that God gives us ways of living a better life. We can talk about how we get from what God said to the candle lighting blessing another time, or you can look at it in the source sheet later. We have the Kiddush, the first line of Kiddush, Borei Pri Hagafen, where we are saying that God is the one that created the fruit of the vine, and that there's only one God, and so God is responsible for everything. God gets all the credit as well as all the complaints. And that growing food involves factors outside of human control. So one way to think about that is that God is involved. We also have the Motzi, where we're saying that God brings forth bread from the ground, except that God doesn't actually bring forth bread from the ground, except maybe breadfruit. We bring forth bread, and so God brings forth the wheat. We have to partner with God to make that happen. Then we have wrestling with God. So we have a text from Genesis where Jacob was alone in the evening, the night before he met his brother Esau, and he wrestled with a being that is strongly suggested to be a divine being. And at the end of the night, the other one wants to go. And Jacob says, not until you give me a blessing. And the being says, okay, fine. Your name will be changed from Jacob to Israel because you have wrestled with beings divine and human. So as the people of Israel, as the descendants of Israel, we are the God wrestlers, and that is okay. Moreover, we have a story from Genesis where God tells Abraham that God is planning on destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham has the chutzpah to argue with the master of the universe, Ribbono Shel Olam, and say, God, shouldn't you be doing the right thing here? And what about if there are good people mixed in with the bad people? Are you going to get rid of the good people? And God says, all right, fine, I won't. If there are 50 good people, innocent people, then I will spare the whole city. And then Abraham takes it a step further and argues God down, all the way down to 10. So as the descendants of Abraham, we have the ability to argue with God and tell God when we think God is wrong. God may not always respond to us, but we can still tell God when we think God is wrong. Another piece of views about God would be the covenant with God. So at Mount Sinai, before the 10 Commandments, God says that if you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, then you will be one of my treasured possessions amongst all the people, and you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So there's this relationship with God where we do our part, God does God's part. Then we have questions about what we know about God. For this, we turn to Yigdal. Yigdal being a set of beliefs about God that has become part of the Friday evening service at the end. And so here's a whole set of ideas about God, that God exists, but is not bounded by time, is different from everything else, has no body, existed before everything, is the master of the whole world, gave prophecy to the Jewish people, that Moses was able to see the likeness of the divine in some fashion, or at least God's back, gave the Torah to us, will not alter the Torah or give us another, or say, actually, we'll supersede that with something else. God foresees the consequences of our actions. There is reward and punishment, either in this life or in the next life. The Messiah will come, and the dead will have life in some fashion, whether that is when the Messiah comes, or that is living on in the impact of their actions and the ways that they are remembered. We also have the 13 attributes of God. So this is when Moses was having a crisis of faith and needed some more support from God after the golden calf incident. And so God said, okay, you hide in a crevice in the rock, or a cleft in the rock, and I will pass before you and you can see my back. And while we're doing this, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. And so God gives these 13 attributes. In the Passover Seder song, Who Knows 1, this is Who Knows 13. 13 are the attributes of God. We also sing these as part of the festival Torah service, although not on Shabbat. Then we have the question of, where do we find God? So at Mount Sinai, when the 10 Commandments were being given, God was very flashy. There was smoke, there was fire, there was loud noises. It was effectively like being at a volcano. On the other hand, we have the story of Elijah, And Elijah had spoken the truth about how there's only one God at a time when people in the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, were following the Phoenician god Baal instead, and Elijah had to run away. And again, he also needed some support from God. And so God passed by, but when there was a big wind, God was not in the wind, and when there was an earthquake, God was not in the earthquake. When there was a fire, God was not in the fire. And then there was a still soft voice called Mama Daka, which is a phrase that is now part of the Untitled Chapter liturgy and the high holidays. And God was in the still soft voice. And so sometimes we find God in the big flashy moments, and sometimes we find God in the smaller, quieter moments. Then we have the idea of God acting through nature. So at the splitting of the sea, despite what all the cinematographers say, it was not a moment of Moses holding out his staff and poof, the water split, but rather there was a strong east wind that blew all night, and that turned the sea into dry ground, and then the waters were split. And so God was acting through nature, through the wind. So you can look at nature and you can see God's presence, or you could say, it's a coincidence, just happened that way. Similarly, we have blessings for big events in nature. For instance, sunrises, sunsets, mountain ranges, seeing Lake Michigan. There's the blessing Oseh Ma'aseh Bereshit, which says that God makes the makings of creation. And there's a blessing for seeing individual things in nature, a specific flower, a specific insect or animal, Shekacha lo be'olamo, where we say, thank you, God, that you have such things in your world. So we can find God in nature. And that brings us up to tonight's topic, the first one, which is God acting through people. Barry Balak, would you read our first text, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Dave. The Birkat Hamazon, is that what I'm seeing?
Yep.
Okay. On Hanukkah and Purim, and we thank you also for the miracles, for the redemption, for the mighty deeds and saving acts you wrought, as well as for the wars which you waged for our ancestors in days of old at this season.
Okay, and it continues.
On Purim, in the days of Mordecai and Esther in Shushan, the capital, when the wicked Haman rose up against them and sought to destroy, to slay, and make to perish all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, on one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Then in your abundant mercy, you brought his counsel to naught, frustrated his design, and returned his recompense upon his own head. And they hanged him and his sons upon the gallows. For all these things, your name, O our ruler, shall be continually blessed and exalted forever and ever.
Okay, and finally that.
Aha Nisim is an extra paragraph added to the Amidah and Birkat Hamazon on Purim and Hanukkah and Yom Ha'atzmaut. It gives credit to God for saving the Jews of Persia from Haman. Yet God is never explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther. This prayer makes the case that God acts through people. Where was God during the Holocaust? acting through the people who tried to make a difference. One more way that the rabbis make this point is that the story of Esther only starts to change when she invites the king and Haman to the first feast. The rabbis notice that the phrase Yavo Hamelech v'Haman Hayom, the king and Haman should come today, is an acronym for God's four-letter name. Oh, that's interesting. Therefore, they deduced that God was present when Esther took action. Kippah tip to Rabbi Michael Siegel. I never heard him say that before, but that's pretty cool. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
Thank you.
Sure.
Gotcha.
I think so. Especially if you look at the experiences of like the multiple different prophets that were sent in Jewish history. They weren't of course doing nothing. They were actually doing things, as part of their divine mission. For example, Amos talking about social justice issues, not just theological problems in the wider society, but also social justice issues that he was actually like working for on the ground, and that was part of his mission, his mission, and also the other prophets' missions in Israel. So I can see it sort of also within like the lives of the prophetic literature and the people in them.
Reminds me of the story of the man sitting on a roof with flooding all around him, and the boat comes by, and a man wants to rescue him, and the man says, "No, God will provide." And God later on says, "Why didn't you get in the boat? I sent it for you." So yes, man has to take action if God's going to help him in any way.
Right.
Other thoughts about this?
I have a
guess-
problem with
Go ahead, Paul.
I'm sorry. I have a problem with the concept of God but only being in the Holocaust for the people who tried to make a difference. That doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, go on.
Well,
Why it's like, is God only acting for good, or is God the like Shiva, the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer?
Mm,
but in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, God would have destroyed everybody until Abraham intervened and worked to try and get God to not destroy everybody.
But he still destroyed everybody.
And well, as it turned out, the way I look at it, when God said he was going to destroy it, if there had been, Abraham said, if there are 50 righteous people, would you destroy the righteous people with them? And apparently, if he hadn't said anything, God would have destroyed the righteous people as well. In the long run, God allowed the one righteous person there to be saved because of Abraham's intervention.
But so unfortunately, so many have righteous people killed during the Holocaust.
So there's not a
Paul,
single righteous person in the Holocaust that perished?
That I can't answer.
And that's fair.
Paul, I think it's a bit definitional around your perspective of what God is and how God manifests, because if you can define that entity, that which we cannot really know, as the first quote says, as being all those things, you can define it as that manifestation within humankind that does good, that creates good, that acts towards good. And if you choose that latter definition, it's perhaps less all-encompassing, but it is driven more towards the positive aspects of what we do as humans.
Coming from that understanding, it might also help to view human nature itself in a dualistic light, sort of the conflict between the good and the evil inclination that exists internally within human beings that I guess permeates the whole problem of evil in general, maybe. Is it, I don't know. I wonder if that could be somewhat a way to approach this as well.
Definitely.
On the other side of the coin, in Torah, or in the entire Chumash, God, it seems that when the people don't follow the commandments, in other words, don't help themselves, God not only doesn't help them, he seems to punish them in many ways. Just the opposite of what is being said here about man having to have a hand in helping what God does.
I heard, I'm not following that.
Well, if God helps man who helps himself, basically is what this is saying. But when man does not follow the commandments, at least in the Chumash, if people don't follow the commandments of God, God not only doesn't help them, he seems to punish them in many ways.
Can you give an example?
Well, you'll get rain for your crops if you do well, if you follow the commandments, but if you don't, not only will I not send you rain, but I'll withhold the rain from you. In other words, you won't get the natural rain that you might get if I didn't help you, but you also won't get the rain because I'll withhold all that.
Would that be related to the understanding of, I guess, what sin is sort of, I guess, how evil or how God works in relation to evil based in Psalm, what is it, 94? I pulled it up. There's a line for it. I think the last line, 23. I'm using from Chabad right now. This is what I just posted. But it says, and he returned upon them their violence, and for their evil may he cut them off, may the Lord our God cut them off. Is that sort of what you're referencing, Herb, I believe?
Yeah.
That sort of understanding within the
Yeah, that kind of understanding.
here. This is
Not
the,
only will God keep his hands off, but he'll do more harm to you than he would otherwise, if you will.
interesting. I'll just put the verse here for reference.
Isn't this alluded to in the verse between Ve'ahavta and Vayomer? Deep seems rain in the proper season. All that is in the verse that's between those two. If you earnestly heed the mitzvot I give you this day, I'll make your life better.
David, I'd like to share a story. In 1981, my father and I went to Israel. It was for the first gathering of Holocaust survivors after the war. And I remember going to they had, a big ceremony at the beginning. And so we were in an outside amphitheater, and I remember that the speaker was saying something along the lines of, that Israel was a redemption for the Holocaust. I didn't quite buy it, because I mean, there were a lot of people that were very religious, followed God's laws, who were murdered during the Holocaust. But somehow, you think after 2,000 years that we, have a country, was that worth it? If you look at it that way.
That's a good question. It's a big question.
May I say, I'm uncomfortable. I don't mean emotionally. It's sort of intellectually maybe with the project of or the framework of trying to resolve all these vexing and really deep philosophical questions. They're deep if you have any belief at all in God or even in the possibility of God, excuse me, and certainly a personal God, by referring to the very interesting rabbinical responses and suggesting that they're persuasive when, of course, the philosophical arguments just go on. And so I would just take a look at just one sentence you have here about the destruction of European Jewry that we call the Holocaust. I put it that way because I don't like that word. It makes it sound like a sacred thing, a burnt offering, which I really don't like, but there it is. Where was God during the Holocaust? Acting through the people who tried to make a difference. I rather would like to see a question mark at the end of the second sentence, because it's just one possibility. Another is he wasn't there. Another is that he wasn't what he was cracked up to be. And obviously a lot of people lost their faith. And when I visited a synagogue once near where my grandfather lived in Philadelphia, I saw on the wall a sign that warned people that and this was only 20 years after the war, that the destruction came upon the Jews because they violated the rule of Shabbos, of mixing linen and wool. Thank you. Right. Obviously, I would have caused the entire thing myself. And in other words, they were saying that the inattention of these religious people to some of the finer points had brought this about. And of course, some people find that embarrassing. Some people find it perhaps persuasive, and it just goes on. We can talk about it, but I think we have to realize that we have questions here. They may not have answers, or they may have the kind of answers that Alan Rosenberg suggests, where you change the focal point about what you're talking about. I don't know if that helps either, but it's an approach to trying to figure out exactly what the question might be. I'm sorry, go on so long.
Don't these two sentences imply that there were no people trying to make a difference?
Well, there are people trying to make a difference, but there was a mass slaughter. And if God was merely acting with people who were trying to make a difference and who may have lost their own lives and all their families in whatever they did, it's rather weak tea, I would say respectfully. Not that people shouldn't try to make a difference, of course, but that's a tragic statement rather than a theologically satisfying one. There's no way it can be.
All right, I think this is a good time to move on to our next text. Why does God allow evil? Steve, would you read this, please?
Steve stepped away. May I read it?
Bevakasha, please.
Thank you. Everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted, and the world is judged with goodness and everything in accordance with the preponderance of works. This text is from Pirkei Avot, a Talmudic collection of quotes from the rabbis who lived between 300 BCE and 200 CE. Rabbi Akiva brings up the idea of free will. God has given us free will as a part of the rules of the universe, which God set up. God is a cheerleader for us to make good decisions. And some define God as the force for good in the world. God is sad when we don't make good decisions. The rabbis depicted God as crying and going into exile when the second temple was destroyed. Only through free will, though, can we be held responsible for our actions. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
God is everywhere. How can God go into exile at all? Where would he go?
It's a fair question.
Well, if it's God, he could go wherever he wanted to, I would think.
They say that God withdrew himself to make room for the universe that he created, which would imply that God is nowhere in the universe. Never did like that explanation.
David, where did the word cheerleader come from? And I mean, it's like a modern word. I mean, who put that in there?
Me, everything in italics I wrote.
Okay, all right. I'm just checking, make sure somebody from 200 CE didn't say that.
Yes. So this is one way of tackling the problem of theodicy, of how does God allow evil in the world if God is good? And the approach that this takes is the idea of free will, that God gave us free will, so God can't, so God restrains God's self from overriding our poor choices when they're going to hurt other people.
Mother turns her back on her two children for a minute. The boy might hit the girl, but if she always paid attention, that might never happen. So there's an example of free will of the boy, if you want to look at it that way. Does God not have the ability to glance away for a minute? Allow free will to occur?
I think it's less that God's not paying attention, insofar as there are texts that say, I think from Psalms, that the guardian of Israel never slumbers, but rather that it's more like a parent who says, I don't think that's a good idea, but I'm not going to stop you. which I know from personal experience about parenting young children. I could see potentially parenting adult children, this coming into play. God willing, I'll get there someday, of saying, you have to live your own life. I can give advice, but I can't make all your decisions for you.
Doesn't that entitle me to hit my sister?
Yes. And then God would be like, and then God would be saying, would be like the parent being like, "Oi, why did you have to go and do that?"
David, when you say, you wrote the sentence, and God is sad when we don't make good decisions. What is your concept of God's sadness? What is this an entity that is sad? What is your construct around that make, that's quote sad when we don't make good decisions?
That's a fair question. I would say when I wrote this, I was being influenced by other texts, which I will see if I can find, about God reacting to our choices. It's a fairly anthropomorphized view of God to say that God is angry or God is sad. But that's one way of looking at God, as responding to us.
I just want to understand, because
Yeah,
if we don't anthropomorphize this thing, this whatever we want to call God, this entity, this unknowable, it's hard to figure that out, but I appreciate it. Thanks.
Dave?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to respond to some of the points about free will. And at least as I see the dialectic in Judaism, we have a strong concept of free will. And that implies that God will not immediately reward and punish the good and the bad, respectively. But at the same time, we have a very strong tradition in Judaism that at some point there is a day of reckoning. And I mean, if you believe that the model of Yom Kippur, when God takes account of, he looks at the books for the year. And while it's not a 1-for-1, but there is a dealing out of justice for those that have, gone over the top to do evil. And that's a very strong tradition in Judaism. And while, a person may not feel God's wrath immediately, but at some point in Judaism, there is this concept that there will be a day of reckoning. I mean, Hitler had his too during the Holocaust, as did many Nazis. It wasn't immediate. I mean, the war schlepped on for several years, but there were a lot of evil people that were destroyed during that war and at the end of the Holocaust as well. Unfortunately, there are a lot of innocent people and good people in the mix too. But I myself believe that at some point there is a day of reckoning for those that do evil. While it may not be determined by following every letter of Torah to exact as it should be, but our concept of Yom Kippur basically has the idea that overall, what was this guy like? And for some people, it's pretty obvious. So just some additional thoughts.
Thank you.
Sure.
Problem is that the columns in the ledger aren't balanced because many more good people perished than the evil people who caused it.
Yeah, no, I know to some extent, there's a lot on the books that still have to be balanced. That's true.
In looking at it that way, I mean, I look at this as, it's like God laid out a game, and he set the rules for the game, which are in the Torah. What you should do, what you shouldn't do, and he kind of left it up to us to play the game. And we have certain responsibilities. Like one of them is love your neighbor as yourself, protect the earth, but we're also, we also have an animal nature, and that's something that is up to us to control and to deal with. So, I think it's kind of like, how do we end up playing the game? I mean, I've read a number of books on the Holocaust and different people's stories. And even people who are considered to be, on the wrong side of history, sometimes made good choices and, to help somebody. So I think ultimately it still falls on us as individuals, to do the things that are good.
I wanted to
Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
return back to what Herb was saying, or I think advocating, where you needed a balance in the ledger. So if there were 6 million Jews killed, there should be a similar, and this is my interpretation, I'm not trying to put words in Herb's mouth, but there should be a similar number of the oppressors who, should suffer as well. But as I remember, I think we discussed in this class, or I know there was at least in some class that I took, that the rabbi said that the biblical call for an eye for an eye was not to be taken literally, but to be, you should find some way of making good. And, if you look at what's happened since the Second World War, Germany has paid reparations, continues to pay reparations. There are new groups added to those for the payments. There's been changes in German society. There's been a lot that has happened to try to provide some balance to what occurred during the war.
I can agree with you, Alan, to a point. But if there were 1,000 evildoers who caused all this, why couldn't God have simply cut off the number who perished as a result to maybe 100,000 instead of 6 million? Why do you have to carry it all? I mean, the ledger is too far off balance for me to accept that totally. Sorry.
You know, we struggle in this class every week to try to understand this phenomenon we call God, the motivations, the background, the reasons, the decisions. God, it turns out, is a very tough parent. And one of the things that bothers me about some of these passages is that it feels like it's lacking in compassion. Yet when we say the 13 attributes, we see that God, Erachon V'Hanun, is compassionate. And I don't see it in a lot of the material that we read. So I need some help with that.
So you're saying, Hinda, that in the 13 attributes we talk about God as compassionate, and you're not seeing that compassion reflected in a lot of the other texts that are in this source sheet?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, Dave.
Go ahead, Alan.
If the death of 6 million Jews and in the Holocaust or whatever we choose to call that horrific event, is not a manifestation of God, is not God's will, is the evil within human beings that manifests itself all too frequently. That we seem to think, or part of the framework of the discussion is because of that, God's manifestation would be revenge of equal proportion on evildoers, on the evildoers of the Holocaust, rather than tremendous good and compassion that exists in the world, and a focus on that, the Mahatma Gandhi's actions and Nelson Mandela's and others, and that sort of positive, compassionate action. And so it may not be that it's a revenge construct, but more we could think about refocusing what God is and God's manifestation to those wonderful acts, and think of it in that framework, just as a possible alternative way of framing it. Then, you know, the Nazis killed 6 million Jews, so now there should be, you know, X millions of them who die. And that's, I don't know, is the side of compassion that Hinda you raise.
Well, I mean, the other thing I'd like to bring up is that there were actually 11 million people that were killed during the war. There were 6 million Jews, but 5 million Poles and Ukrainian.
And there was, and Stalin.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So, I mean, there are many more people were murdered during the conflict.
Important point.
One thing I wanted to say, and I don't want to minimize the richness of this discussion, which has been beautiful and difficult. But one of the things I like about this source sheet and the way you've been dragging us through all these sources, and the rapid review at the beginning reminded me of this, is the really remarkable fact that the tradition has preserved them all, and that they're all still here, and they all have some kind of historical, scholarly, spiritual, religious validity, which kind of speaks to the problem that there is clearly no answer, clearly no single answer that any of us will find satisfactory for so many of these really dreadful things that we see in the world. So I like the way you're presenting this, because it kind of helps us watch the rabbis and the sages test out different ideas to deal with the same struggles we're having. And each one may speak to some piece of a problem, but to Phil's point, if you try to apply any single answer, it's very weak tea indeed. None of them works as the single sweeping answer. So I want to thank you for both helping us and challenging us to work through them.
I agree with all that.
Thank you. All right, recognizing the time, I'm just glancing ahead. If you'll permit me, and if you guys have a few more minutes, we have not another full class worth of material on this topic. So I'd like to present the last two pieces to you, and then you can stay on and talk about it, or you can leave and think about it on your own time. But if you'll permit me to go over, I'd like to share the last two pieces.
Okay.
So another question would be, how do we bring God into our lives? And for this, I turn to the Shechianu, which says in English, praise to you, Lord our God, rule the universe, who has kept us alive and sustained us and brought us to this time. And the remarks on this, the Shechianu blessing is one which we say anytime we do something for the first time, or for the first time in a year, or when we reach a milestone worth marking. It's a way of bringing holiness into moments, recognizing that we didn't reach a certain point by our own actions solely, but rather through the aid of others, including God. Saying this blessing is a way of marking how special moments are also. One of the big ideas in Judaism is having an attitude of gratitude, and saying this blessing keeps us grateful that we have made it to whatever moment we are marking. Does this way of thinking about God work for you? Well, maybe we discuss this for 2 or 3 minutes and then go on to the last piece.
Yeah, I like this blessing a lot because I think in the morning prayers, we say we kind of be thankful for God for bringing us not only to the morning, the evening, and the afternoon, but to each moment that we have. So it's a beautiful blessing.
For me, I like the idea of the gratitude. I think oftentimes we forget to be grateful for things. And so this is a good reminder for this.
Yeah, it's a reminder we made it through another year.
Right. Especially in the
We're
last
there
couple
to commemorate something, certainly. It's just sometimes we say time goes by and we don't even realize it's going by. This is one way of pausing for a moment to think about that.
David, thank you for saying that we don't succeed, or we usually don't succeed based on our own actions only, but it's dependent on others including God as opposed to depending on God. And it just kind of brings me back to a number of articles I've read recently since Elon Musk put in his bid to buy Twitter, and so many people were saying, oh, you know, he built Tesla and SpaceX and all by himself. And that's why he is who he is, and he's the richest person in the world. But, you know, it all, and, you know, the same could be said about Jeff Bezos and others. But it minimizes the fact that they may have had a good idea, but it could only have been executed with the assistance of hundreds or thousands of other talented people who helped get them where they are today. But we tend to forget them and idolize the person at the top.
Good point, Alan.
Finally, looking at the last text, this is one God, many names. In the Jewish tradition, there are a lot of ways of referring to God. And I recognize the font is a little small here, so I'm going to read through some of them. This is not all of them. God. Oh, and think about like which ones particularly work for you. God, Lord, the name, merciful one, eternal one, dweller, strong one, master of the world, the most high, our Father, our King, the Creator, I will be what I will be, God the strong, truth, without end, Holy One, holiness of Israel, King, Shalom, Shepherd, Rock of Israel, healer of the sick, freer of the captives, clother of the naked, opener of blind eyes, supporter of the fallen, straightener of the bent, fashioner of light, maker of peace, life giver to the dead, life giver to all, ruler of the universe, shepherd of Israel, the ruler of the world, the place, Shekhinah, and then some spots to put in your own names for God. Do any of these call to you in particular?
I use the master of the world at night in a prayer that Rabbi Glick taught me, but otherwise I just use God. I mean, there's so many other names, it's too many.
Yeah.
Like in your preschool, Alan, if we told the kids all these names, they might have a hard time trying to figure out, you know, what we're talking about.
Well, my guess is to preschoolers, a lot of these names wouldn't have any meaning.
Any meaning, right?
I use Master of the Universe.
What?
I use Master of the Universe.
Yeah. Okay, master of the universe, the world, right. I like that one too.
I wish maker of peace were more widespread.
So, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Barry. So in the Torah itself, there are the concept of Elohim and Adonai, which have different perspectives on God as well. I always found even those were introduced a lot of complication. And your list here is like really over the top. But my own feeling is that if we have the right to sometimes behave in different ways, certainly God has that right to sometimes show a different side of him or herself to us. And you know, it depends on the situation. So to some extent, I think we could find examples of each of these for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it, that
Yeah.
one person is many things to many people. It could be a child, a parent, a spouse, a sibling, a doctor, a friend, a lot of different relationships with God. And so the different names for God reflect different people's experiences of God and relationships with God at different times in their life.
Yeah. Very much so.
I have a lot of difficulty with the idea of master of the world, because if God was really in charge of everything, then I think there's something wrong with that God. And I feel more so that that it's our own actions, and I feel like the concept of ourselves in partnership with God just makes much more sense in understanding what we see going on in the world right now, particularly.
David, did I misunderstand from earlier in the discussion, but wouldn't the small quiet voice also be a name for
Absolutely.
that?
Absolutely.
I mean, that was that whole.
This is not an exhaustive list.
I know. I just think that's
But
an
yeah.
interesting one, since we discussed it earlier, to not.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I may have told this story once before to this class, but I don't know how many of you have read the book or seen the movie This Is Where I Leave You, about a shiva for a Jewish man who had passed away, and as his children are remembering their life with him, he was very secular in his Judaism, and every once in a while on a Shabbat, he'd go get the kids up on Saturday morning and say, "Put on your good clothes, we're going to temple." And he would drag them to the synagogue, and one day his son leaned over to him during the service, because he was very bored with all of it, and he said, "Dad, do you really believe in God?" And the father said, "No." And he said, "Well, then why are you making us get dressed up and dragging us here to sit and listen to this?" And he said, "Well, I've been known to be wrong once in a while in my life." So apparently he was just it's a very funny movie and a very good book. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. So speaking of This Is Where I Leave You, I think this is a good time to wrap up the class. And so I'll stop the recording.